really know what a monopoly is, and I'm not talking about the board game, I'm talking about the type of monopolies that affect your and my everyday life. You're probably thinking to yourself, there aren't any monopolies anymore. Monopolies existed a long time ago. There's no way monopolies can affect me today. Well, the truth is, modern day monopolies exist in the world. The Investopedia.com defines a monopoly as a company and the product it offers dominates a sector, market, or industry. Monopolies are an ever-growing threat to your and my everyday life. To prevent the spread of modern-day monopolies, the government must employ the solution of strengthening and enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Act, and the Federal Trade Commission Act. The biggest problem with modern-day monopolies is that they harm you and me. Monopolies harm us by controlling large portions of the market they're in. Monopolies today are not technically considered to be monopolies, but if you look at the statistics, they obviously are. Big corporations still exist through the Sherman, Clayton, and Federal Trade Commissions Act. These companies are very tricky. Most have found loopholes and ways around the acts. John Malden, who is a senior writer for Forbes, states that a large growing part of our economy is owned by only a handful of companies that face very little competition. Let's look at some statistics. 3 large companies control 80% of the mobile telecoms market. 3 control 90% of the credit card market, as well as 4 control nearly 50% of all the airline travel around the world. An example of a company with a clear but not technically considered monopoly is Monsanto. Monsanto produces an astronomical 61% of global seed, which obviously affects produce prices. The obviously but not technically considered to be monopolistic companies greatly affect you and I in many, many ways. The biggest way is through price fixing. Monopolies will set the price of a good or service ridiculously high, and the people, you and I, have to pay it. An example of this is gasoline. Will Kenton has had over 10 years of experience journaling with Investopedia.com, states that OPEC controls roughly 75% of the world's total crude oil reserves. We, the common people society, have no choice but to hand over the money. Monopolies today also tend to decline the quality of goods. We have all heard the saying, they just don't make them like they used to. Well, I wonder why. The Business Essential, InsightsEssential.com states that if a company gets a monopoly on a market, without a question, the quality of the service will go down. There's virtually no point in a company to improve their product or service when they dominate nearly the entire market. There is a way to rid away modern day monopolistic companies. They were employed and were effective during the 1890s and 1900s, and their purpose was to aggressively identify and break up big monopolies. The Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Act, and the Federal Trade Commission Act is our solution. The Sherman Antitrust Act is the first main defense against monopolies. The editors of Britannica.com states that one of the Act's main provision outlaws combinations that restrict trade between states or with foreign nations. It basically was created to prevent monopolies. It prevents cartels to be formed, price fixing, and rigged bids. It, however, only pertained to only a handful of companies because over the years, big companies found a way around the acts. The act was later reinforced by the Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act in 1914. The government must continue to reinforce the act again to conform to 21st century times and then enforce it. The Clayton Act, as stated before, reinforces the Sherman Antitrust Act. The act adds strength to the general policies of the Sherman Act, as well as points out illegal activity that pertains to a monopoly. It also prevents mergers that would decrease the overall competition of a market, as well as it stands against unethical business practices. The act was later strengthened twice in 1936 and 1950. The government must continue to update the act to identify these problems in 2020 to break up controlling companies. The Federal Trade Commission Act, like the Clayton Act, strengthens the Sherman Act as stated before. The act basically created a force to go after monopolies. It allowed them to pick out monopolies and investigate them. The Department of Justice states that the act prohibits unfair methods of competition between interstate commerce. The act also allowed the use of legal tools to pursue companies. It also helps protect us, the consumer, from unfair business practices while also creating fair and equal competition for all companies. The act has not been updated since. The government has to create new agendas in the act to prevent companies from finding loopholes in the outdated policies. Through the process of strengthening and enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Act, and the Federal Trade Commission Act, monopolies will no longer affect the common people like you and me. If there is nothing done, monopolies will continue to go unrivaled and price fix and lower the quality of goods or services that we must have. Now that you're well informed that monopolies exist and control the major markets we live in today, you can help advocate the solution to fix it. Let us all try to change the world for the better and rid away monopolies while making our lives better in the process.